Hello, my name is Jessica, and today we're going to be discussing how the chess pieces move and the basic rules of the game. Let's get started. So to start off here, we're going to look at the starting position of a chessboard, which involves our 8 pawns in front here. We have our rooks, these little castle guys here on the corners. Next, we have our knights, bishops, and finally our queen and our king right in the center of our board, our royal couple there. So let's take a kind of look at this board a bit closer here. So you're gonna see letters on the bottom and numbers on the side. And what these correlate to are algebraic notation, which is kind of how we discuss moves in chess. So for example, this square here has a name. We refer to it as C4. So we always use the letter first and then the number. So if we were referring to this square here, we would refer to it as C4. And if we wanted to talk about a piece going to that square, for example, this pawn here, we could say pawn to C4. Or with pawns, it's kind of a specific rule. We actually don't have to say that it's a pawn. If we just say C4, the move here that is implied is pawn to C4. If we were to move a different piece to a different square, let's say we get our pawns out of our way here, and now we were to move our bishop to C4, we'd say bishop C4, just like I did there. One final thing to talk about when we're talking about the setup of our board here. If you're setting up your board at home, you want to make sure that the right-hand corner is a white square. And so that'll apply on both sides. You just want to make sure you're not using your chessboard sideways, which happens a lot in movies, and it can be frustrating, but at home we want to make sure that it's all set up perfectly. So we want to make sure the right-hand corner is a light colored square, and we want to make sure that if we're playing as white ourselves, that the letters on the bottom say A through H, and if we're playing as black, they will say H through A. So they're kind of backwards. We look at the whole board kind of in reverse when we're playing as black here. So in chess, white always plays first. They always make the starting move, and then black follows. This gives a small advantage to white. Nothing big, nothing that we can use to try to fight for a win just because we got to play the first move. And in tournaments, usually we'll kind of go back and forth between playing white in a game and playing as black in a game. So everything all tends to even out in the end. So now let's jump into how the chess pieces actually move. We're going to be looking at these pieces one by one individually here. So we're going to start off with pawns. We're going to start off first with how our pieces move, how they attack, and then some special rules might get thrown in as well. So for example, pawns have quite a few special rules, more than most of the other pieces. We're going to start off with just the basics, how they move. Pawns move one move at a time unless it is the first time that pawn is moving. And then it is allowed, and only on that first move, to move 2 squares. So for example, this pawn here we see is still on its starting square of E2. So this pawn is allowed to jump 2 whole squares forward if it wants to. That's not to say that it can't also jump 1 square. But this is the only opportunity in the game that it will be allowed to jump 2 squares here. After this pawn is only allowed to move 1 square at a time. So if black here were to make a move, we can see the only legal move now for this pawn is to move 1 square forward. Pawns move forward, they can't move backwards, they can't move diagonal or sideways, they can only move forward, but they can only attack and defend diagonally. So for example, this pawn here sitting on B7 can only move forward 1 square, but he's defending these 2 squares at the moment. So he's defending these 2 diagonal squares. So if this A pawn were to move forward here, this pawn could capture, just like we see here. The next kind of special rule we'll talk about with pawns also refers to capturing. And this is kind of a little bit of a sneaky rule. So let's look at this pawn here. He's defending these 2 squares, and the one that we're going to be really focusing on here is C6. So this pawn is making it difficult for this pawn to be able to jump forward. Let's say white just makes any random move, so now it's black's turn. If black here were to try to jump past this pawn and kind of make it so it seems like our pawn for a moment can't catch him because he's past us now, we can still capture here. We can even see that this is a legal move here, and we can capture. And this is called en passant, French for in passing. So this pawn tried to pass us by, we still get to capture here. And we'll look at one of our final rules here for pawns. When pawns get to the end of the board, and this often happens in the endgame when there are less pieces on the board, pawns can promote. So let's say this pawn starts running. There's no one that can catch him. If this king starts trying to run over, we'll see he's just a bit too slow. Maybe not a bit, he's quite too slow here. This pawn, now that he reaches the end of the board, gets to choose which stronger piece they want to become. So we'll talk about piece value as we go. Pawns are worth on their own just 1 point. So they're not worth a lot, but they can become a much stronger piece. So for example, here, this pawn can become a queen now. So that's all we really need to talk about with pawns. Let's jump into knights now. So knights, or horsies as my younger students call them, move in an L shape, meaning they move 2 squares up and 1 square over, so he can move to F3, or 1 square up and 2 squares over, so he could also move to E2. Knights can move in any direction as long as they're following that L shape, so they can move forward and back. They can move sideways, so all of the legal spots this knight can go. We can see he can move toward the middle of the board. If this knight were to follow, we can see this knight can jump backwards now. He can go in any direction that he'd like. Knights attack in the exact same way that they move, unlike pawns, so they defend all of these squares that they can move to. If anything were to jump into one of these squares, our knight would be able to capture it. And knights are the only pieces in the game that can jump over other pieces because of how they're designed. So if we had, let's say, a whole row of pawns here, this knight could still jump to this square. Nothing can really get in the way of a knight's jumping here. The last thing we'll mention here with knights is their point value. So we were talking about how pawns are worth 1 point, knights are worth 3. So they're kind of worth 3 pawns. So we don't want to trade a knight for a single pawn. We'll end up being down 2 points in the end. We'll move on to now our bishops, our next minor piece. Bishops are worth the same points as knights. They're both worth 3 points. There are some people, however, that argue that bishops are maybe worth closer to 3.5 points. I'm not sure if that makes such a big difference, but just keep that in mind, that sometimes bishops can seem a little bit stronger than knights, and that's why some people want to throw in that extra 0.5 point for them. So bishops move along the diagonals, and we'll see that our bishops stay on the same color square that they start off. For example, this dark squared bishop will always be a dark squared bishop. It can never move to a light square, it can never defend or attack a light square. So this bishop moves along these dark squares here, this bishop moves along these light squares here. Okay, now we're gonna jump into our rooks, our first major piece. Rooks are worth 5 points, so a bit more than a knight or a bishop, similar to maybe a knight and bishop combined. Our rooks move along straight lines, so they move up and down, side to side, and they attack and defend in the exact same way. For example, in this kind of silly position here where I've removed all the other pieces off the board, we can see this rook gets captured here with ease. And now the king is in check, we see. Okay, that's all we really need to discuss with rooks. Moving on to our most powerful piece, our queen. So queens can move like a rook and a bishop combined, meaning they can move along the straight lines, up and down, side to side, as well as diagonals. And they're even a little bit stronger than just kind of a rook and a bishop combined, because our queen can also move over and control different colored diagonals, unlike our bishop, as we remember. Queens are worth 9 points. So they are the most valuable piece on the board, with rooks being a close second. Although they're the most valuable, I wouldn't say that they are the most important, because without our king on the board, we simply wouldn't be playing chess. We can't lose our king or else the game will be over. So we're gonna go over our kings next. Our kings aren't really given a point because they're kind of priceless. We just can't lose them, like I was saying. So we'll look at how our kings move here. Kings are kind of like much slower versions of our queens. They can move 1 square every direction. There is one small exception to this. Kings have a special rule called castling, and this is a great move to help protect our king and activate our rooks that sit on the edges here. So when we castle, we move our king 2 squares toward the rook, and the rook jumps onto the other side of us, as we see here. And we'll go ahead and look at that one more time. The king jumps over 2 squares, and the rook jumps onto the other side. Like I said, a great way to protect our king, and now our rook is nice and activated and ready to fight. There are a few rules that we have to follow with castling. We can't ever put this king in danger, even if he's passing through a square that could potentially put him in danger. For example, F1 here is being controlled by Black's light squared bishop. So we can't castle through check. We also can't castle out of check. For example, if this queen were to deliver check here, the king could not simply castle to get out of this danger. He'd have to just run to one direction, and now that this king has moved, he never has the option to castle again. Once either the king or the rook has moved once, they can no longer castle. Even if this queen ran back and the king tried to jump back into his starting square, this king has moved already. So it is now impossible for him to castle, unfortunately. Our final rule with castling here, just like we're not allowed to castle through check or out of check, we're not allowed to castle into check. And this kind of follows one big rule with our king. We're never allowed to put our king in danger. We legally in chess cannot put our king into check. So for example, I cannot castle here if I were playing as Black because my king would be taken on the next move. And as we know, our kings can't be captured in chess. So this just simply is an illegal move here to try to castle. In online chess, it simply won't allow you to do it. For example, if White moves their pawn here and you're playing as Black and you keep trying to click this, it's not going to allow it. In over the board chess, meaning when we play with the physical board and physical pieces, obviously the board doesn't know when we're breaking rules. So you have to be vigilant and watch your opponent and make sure that they're not trying to castle illegally into check, out of check, or through check. Speaking of check, let's look at how the game can end. Kind of the main goal of chess is that we want to checkmate our opponent. So a checkmate is similar to a check, as we were seeing when our king is being attacked, we're in check. On online chess here, the king turns red, as we can see he's in danger. And here, this is not checkmate because Black has a way to respond. Can simply run away here. But if we were to give check here now, this would be checkmate. This king cannot move to either of these squares because of our queen, and he cannot move to either of these squares again because of our queen. And he cannot capture our queen here because she's defended by our rook. So this king is in checkmate here. When we get checkmate, we win the game. So we get the full point for the game. But there is a slightly worse option that can also be achieved. We see coming back here, this king doesn't have any squares at the moment. If White decides, I'm simply going to try to promote my pawn, I'm going to get a second queen on the board, maybe a third, I'm going to get as many queens as possible, we end up stalemating our opponent. And stalemating is kind of what it sounds. I kind of like to describe it as a stale version of checkmating. It's not quite as good. This king has no legal moves, and yet it is his turn to move. And we're not allowed to move our king into check. So this actually becomes a draw, a tie in chess, where each player earns half a point. Instead of going back here, if we had just delivered checkmate, for example, on this square, White here would have gotten the full point, Black would have gotten 0. But if we are not careful and we stalemate our opponent, we each walk away with half a point. Not quite as good here. That's all I have for you today. If you feel like you missed anything, feel free to rewind the video and watch it as many times as you need. And to dive in further on chess, hop into a live class, and we'll see you next time.